Tonight, what we are witnessing is as militarily significant as it is psychologically devastating for a Russian leadership that believed its defensive fortifications were impenetrable. Ukrainian forces have breached what Russian commanders called their fortress line, the most heavily fortified defensive position constructed since the Second World War, achieving a breakout that has stunned the Kremlin and sent shockwaves through Russian military planning across the Russian entire theater of operations. The breach occurred along a 12-kilometer sector that Russian engineers had spent over 2 years constructing, fortifying with concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields measuring kilometers in depth, and interconnected trench systems designed to channel any attacker into pre-registered kill zones. All of it failed. Ukrainian combined arms forces penetrated the first defensive belt in under 4 hours, the second belt by nightfall, and by this morning had achieved operational depth that Russian doctrine insisted was impossible against properly prepared defenses. Imagine this: Russian commanders watching real-time reports as Ukrainian forces advance through defensive positions that were supposed to hold for weeks or months, positions that generals had personally assured Putin could withstand any assault Ukraine could mount. Picture the frantic communications as unit after unit reports positions overrun, as the carefully planned defensive scheme collapses faster than reserves can be repositioned, as the fortress that was supposed to guarantee Russian control of occupied territory becomes a monument to Russian military failure. Visualize Ukrainian armored columns advancing through gaps that widen by the hour, infantry clearing bunkers whose defenders surrender rather than die for positions their commanders told them were impregnable. Sounds like the kind of breakthrough that transforms wars. But tonight, as Ukrainian forces exploit their breach and Russian commanders scramble to establish new defensive lines, this transformation is already underway. What we are witnessing is not a lucky penetration of a weak point or an exploitation of a localized failure. It is the systematic defeat of Russian defensive doctrine by Ukrainian offensive capability that has evolved beyond what Russian military planners believed possible, the demonstration that fortifications Russian engineers designed to be impenetrable can be breached by forces employing methods those engineers never anticipated. Ukraine has effectively said, "Your fortress line was not a fortress. Your impenetrable defenses have been penetrated. Your assumptions about what we could accomplish were wrong." That's not propaganda or premature celebration. That's operational reality, measured in kilometers of advance through positions Russia spent years preparing. Think about that. Russia invested enormous resources, billions of rubles, millions of man-hours, the concentrated expertise of their military engineering corps constructing defensive positions specifically designed to prevent exactly what has now occurred. They studied Ukrainian offensive operations, identified Ukrainian tactics, and built defenses intended to defeat those tactics comprehensively. Ukrainian forces breached those defenses in hours, not the weeks or months Russian planning assumed would be required even under worst-case scenarios. Every assumption underlying Russian defensive strategy has been proven catastrophically wrong. Here's the first hook. When your fortress line falls in hours, when the defenses you built over years collapse in a single day, when positions you guaranteed were impregnable are overrun before reserves can even begin moving to reinforce them, you haven't just lost a battle. You've lost the entire strategic foundation of your defensive planning, the assumption that prepared positions could hold against Ukrainian attacks long enough for reserves to stabilize the line. That assumption died in the breach. Russian commanders must now plan, knowing that no defensive line is safe. This is not about one sector's failure. It's about the systematic revelation that Ukrainian offensive capability has surpassed Russian defensive capability in ways that threaten every fortified position Russia has constructed, that the balance of military effectiveness has shifted decisively, that the fortress lines Russia built to guarantee territorial control cannot accomplish that mission against forces whose capability exceeds Russian expectations. The breach proves that what happened here can happen anywhere. Ukrainian forces choose to concentrate their strength against Russian defenses. For over 2 years, Russian military engineers have labored to construct what they called the most formidable defensive fortifications since the Wehrmacht's Atlantic Wall, a comparison they made with pride that now seems bitterly ironic given how both defensive systems ultimately performed against determined attackers. The Russian fortress line incorporated every lesson Soviet and Russian military doctrine had accumulated about defensive warfare lessons from the Great Patriotic War, from Soviet defensive planning against NATO, from the study of fortifications throughout military history. Russian engineers believed they had created something that could hold indefinitely against any force Ukraine could generate. The defensive architecture reflected this confidence in its elaborate and meticulously planned construction, incorporating every defensive technique that Russian military doctrine had identified as effective. The first belt consisted of anti-tank ditches measuring 4 meters deep and 6 meters wide, excavated by engineering units working around the clock for months and designed to stop any armored vehicle attempting to cross without specialized bridging equipment. Behind these ditches, row after row of concrete dragon's teeth obstacles created a maze designed to channel any vehicles that somehow crossed the ditches into narrow lanes where pre-positioned anti-tank weapons could destroy them systematically. The minefields protecting this first belt exceeded anything previously documented in modern warfare, with densities reaching 15 mines per linear meter in some sectors, a concentration that meant any vehicle attempting to cross would almost certainly strike multiple mines before reaching friendly positions. These weren't simple pressure-activated devices, but sophisticated combinations of anti-tank mines capable of destroying the heaviest armored vehicles and anti-personnel mines designed to kill the infantry that would need to accompany any breaching attempt. The minefields extended for kilometers in depth, creating a zone of death that Russian planners believed no force could cross without catastrophic casualties. Behind these obstacles, reinforced concrete bunkers provided protected firing positions for anti-tank guided missiles, heavy machine guns, and automatic grenade launchers, each bunker positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire that would catch any attackers who survived the obstacles in devastating crossfire from multiple directions simultaneously. These bunkers were constructed to withstand direct hits from artillery and all but the heaviest guided munitions, with walls measuring over 1 meter thick and overhead protection designed to survive anything short of precision bunker-buster weapons. The trench systems connecting these bunkers enabled defenders to shift forces along the line without exposing themselves to the direct fire that would make such movement suicidal, while underground passages provided complete protection against the artillery and air attack that doctrine assumed would precede any ground assault. The second defensive belt, positioned several kilometers behind the first, replicated and enhanced this architecture while adding additional features specifically intended to stop any attackers fortunate or skilled enough to penetrate the initial positions. Command bunkers with hardened communications enabled coordination of defensive fires. Artillery positions pre-registered on likely avenues of approach could deliver devastating concentrations on any force attempting to exploit gaps in the first belt. Reserve positions enabled rapid reinforcement of threatened sectors. The entire system was designed as defense in depth. Even if attackers penetrated one belt, subsequent belts would stop them while counterattack forces eliminated the penetration. The third belt, deeper still, provided the final line before open terrain that Russian forces believed attackers could never reach. This belt featured the heaviest fortifications, the strongest garrisons, and the most extensive minefields, positioned on the assumption that any force reaching it would already be depleted from fighting through the first two belts and would lack the combat power to continue. Russian commanders considered this belt the ultimate guarantee. Even in worst-case scenarios, they believed the third belt would hold. Think about that. Russian engineers constructed 3 complete defensive belts, each designed to stop attacks that penetrated the previous belt, each fortified with obstacles, bunkers, and firepower that doctrine said would require overwhelming force to overcome. Ukrainian forces breached all three belts in approximately 36 hours. The fortress that was supposed to hold for months fell in less than 2 days. For nearly 18 months, Ukrainian military planners studied these Russian defenses with the extraordinary intensity that only existential stakes can motivate, analyzing every available source of intelligence to understand exactly what they would face when the assault came and exactly how they might overcome obstacles that Russian doctrine said were insurmountable. This planning effort represented the most comprehensive intelligence preparation Ukrainian forces had ever undertaken. A recognition that breaching the fortress line would require understanding it in detail that exceeded even the knowledge of Russian officers commanding its defense. Satellite imagery revealed the fortifications' layout in remarkable detail, with commercial and military satellites providing coverage that identified individual bunker positions, traced the exact routes of obstacle belts, mapped the interconnected trench systems, and documented the defensive architecture Russian engineers had constructed with such confidence. Ukrainian intelligence analysts spent months studying this imagery, building three-dimensional models of the defensive positions, identifying fields of fire, locating command bunkers, and developing understanding of the defensive system that would enable effective attack planning. Signals intelligence intercepted communications that revealed defensive plans, unit dispositions, and the coordination procedures Russian forces would employ when the assault began. These intercepts provided insight into Russian defensive doctrine as actually practiced, revealing differences between theoretical doctrine and actual procedures that created vulnerabilities planners could exploit. Communications between Russian commanders, discussing concerns about specific sectors, conversations about supply problems affecting certain units, arguments about responsibility for defensive gaps, all of this provided intelligence that shaped Ukrainian planning in ways Russian defenders apparently never anticipated. Human sources embedded within Russian military structures or with access to Russian military information provided details about garrison strengths, morale conditions among defending units, and the specific equipment defending key positions. These sources identified which units were experienced and well supplied versus which were depleted and demoralized, enabling planners to select assault sectors where defenders would be least able to resist effectively. The human intelligence complemented technical collection in ways that created an intelligence picture more comprehensive than either source could provide alone. Drone reconnaissance mapped minefields with precision that enabled breaching planning, identified gaps in obstacle coverage that might be exploited, and documented defensive positions in detail that supplemented satellite imagery. The drones flew thousands of missions over months of preparation, some detected and destroyed by Russian air defense, but most returning with imagery and video that built ever more complete understanding of what Ukrainian forces would face. Think about that. Ukrainian intelligence spent 18 months studying Russian defenses, employing every collection method available, building understanding that enabled identifying vulnerabilities Russian engineers had overlooked or underestimated. The breach succeeded in part because Ukrainian planning exceeded Russian defensive awareness, because Ukrainian forces understood Russian defenses better than Russian commanders understood Ukrainian capabilities. The assault force that executed the breach represented the culmination of Ukrainian military development since the war began. Units equipped with Western armor, trained in NATO combined arms doctrine, experienced through years of combat, and motivated by the knowledge that the territory beyond the fortress line was Ukrainian land occupied by invaders. These were not the improvised forces of the war's early months, but professional military formations whose capability matched or exceeded that of any NATO member's frontline units. Let's be honest about the magnitude of what these forces accomplished. They breached defensive fortifications that Russian military doctrine said should have held against forces many times their size. They achieved in hours what Russian planning assumed would require weeks, even under the most pessimistic assumptions. They demonstrated that Ukrainian offensive capability has reached levels that Russian defensive preparations cannot counter, regardless of how much time and resources Russia invests in fortification construction. And yet, Russian defenders apparently believed their positions were secure until Ukrainian forces were already through the first obstacle belt, a failure of situational awareness that reflects deeper problems in Russian military culture and command. The reconnaissance that should have detected Ukrainian preparations failed to identify the assault force assembling. The intelligence that should have warned of imminent attack was absent or dismissed. The defensive procedures that should have alerted garrisons to prepare for assault were not triggered until assault was already underway. Russian forces were caught, if not entirely by surprise, then at least unprepared for the speed and violence of Ukrainian action. Here's the second hook. You can build fortresses for years, deploy garrisons you believe are adequate, construct obstacles you believe are impassable. But you cannot hold positions when you fail to detect the attack until it's already overwhelming your defenses. Russian defensive preparations were extensive, but Russian defensive awareness was catastrophically inadequate. The fortress fell not just because Ukrainian forces were capable, but because Russian forces weren't ready, despite occupying positions specifically constructed to enable readiness. The breach itself unfolded with a speed and violence that Russian defenders could not match, could not comprehend, and could not resist until it was far too late to organize the effective response that defensive doctrine prescribed. Ukrainian artillery opened the assault with concentrated fires of devastating intensity on identified bunker positions, command posts, communication nodes, and the assembly areas where reserve forces might gather to respond to the breach. This artillery preparation employed not just traditional high-explosive rounds, but precision-guided munitions that struck specific targets with accuracy that Russian defenders had not experienced before bunker apertures hit directly, communication antennas destroyed, command vehicles targeted individually. Simultaneously with the artillery preparation, Ukrainian electronic warfare systems activated jamming programs that disrupted Russian communications across the entire defensive sector, preventing the rapid information sharing and coordination that Russian defensive doctrine absolutely required. Radio networks that connected frontline positions to battalion and brigade headquarters suddenly filled with static or went silent entirely. The digital systems that enabled encrypted communication between commanders ceased functioning. Within minutes of the assault's initiation, Russian defenders found themselves isolated, unable to communicate with adjacent units to understand the scope of the attack, unable to reach higher headquarters to request guidance or support, unsure what was happening beyond the immediate vicinity of their individual positions. The psychological effect of this communications disruption compounded the physical effect of the artillery preparation. Defenders in bunkers could hear explosions in adjacent sectors, but could not determine whether those explosions represented attacks on their neighbors' positions or merely harassing fires. They could not request artillery support because they could not reach fire coordination centers. They could not call for reserves because they could not contact headquarters. Each position became an isolated island, its defenders forced to respond to whatever they could see without knowledge of the broader situation that might have enabled coordinated response. As artillery suppressed defensive positions and electronic warfare isolated defenders from support, Ukrainian engineering teams advanced toward the obstacle belts using techniques and specialized equipment that Russian defensive planners apparently had not adequately anticipated or prepared to counter. Mine-clearing systems opened lanes through minefields that were supposed to channel attackers into kill zones. Bridging equipment crossed anti-tank ditches that were supposed to stop armored advance. The obstacles that had taken months to construct were breached in minutes by teams that had trained specifically for these tasks and executed them with precision that reflected that training. Behind the engineers, Ukrainian armor poured through the gaps in assault formations that maximized speed and violence. Tanks and infantry fighting vehicles advanced not in the cautious probing attacks that Russian doctrine expected, but in aggressive thrusts that reached defensive positions before garrisons could organize resistance. Ukrainian infantry dismounted to clear bunkers whose occupants faced the choice of surrender or death, with many choosing surrender when the hopelessness of their position became apparent. The coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and engineers, the essence of combined arms warfare, was executed with proficiency that overwhelmed defenders who had never experienced such concentrated capability. The penetration of the first defensive belt occurred faster than Russian commanders could process. The reports reaching their headquarters reports that were fragmentary and delayed due to the communications disruption Ukrainian electronic warfare had achieved. By the time headquarters understood that the first belt had been breached, Ukrainian forces were already engaging the second belt with the same speed and violence that had overwhelmed the first. Reserves that should have moved to contain the penetration were still receiving orders to assemble when Ukrainian forces reached positions those reserves were supposed to defend. Think about that. Russian defensive planning assumed that the time required for attackers to breach each defensive belt would provide opportunity to move reserves, coordinate counterattacks, and stabilize the situation before penetrations could be exploited. Ukrainian forces moved so fast that this assumption proved worthless. The defensive scheme collapsed not because individual positions failed to resist, but because the system couldn't react quickly enough to address breaches before they widened into breakouts. The extraordinary speed of Ukrainian advance through the second and third defensive belts reflected the cascading and accelerating collapse of Russian defensive coherence once the first belt was breached in ways that Russian commanders could not arrest, regardless of the measures they attempted. Defenders in subsequent belts, receiving fragmentary reports and watching the first belt overrun, experienced the devastating psychological impact of watching positions they had been told were impregnable fall in hours rather than the weeks or months defensive planning had assumed. Their confidence in their own positions constructed to the same specifications as those now burning, collapsed alongside the first belt's physical collapse. Communications disruption prevented the coordination that might have enabled defenders in subsequent belts to prepare for the assault they now knew was coming. Without communications, defenders could not receive orders about how to respond, could not coordinate with adjacent units to establish coherent defensive lines, could not request the artillery and air support that might have slowed Ukrainian advance. Each defensive position responded based only on what its immediate commanders could observe, without the situational awareness that might have enabled effective response to the developing breakthrough. The reserves that Russian defensive doctrine prescribed for containing penetrations were not positioned to intervene effectively because the speed of Ukrainian advance exceeded anything Russian planning had anticipated by a factor of 5 or more. Reserves positioned hours behind the front, which doctrine said would have ample time to move forward and establish blocking positions, found that Ukrainian forces had already advanced past the positions those reserves were supposed to defend before they could even complete their movement. The entire defensive scheme, built on assumptions about how long each belt would hold, collapsed when those assumptions proved wildly optimistic. Each Ukrainian success built on previous success, creating momentum that defenders found impossible to arrest through any available countermeasure. Units that routed from forward positions spread panic to units behind them. Defenders who saw adjacent positions overrun lost confidence in their own ability to hold. The psychological cascade amplified the physical breakthrough, transforming what might have been a contained penetration into a complete defensive collapse across the entire sector. By nightfall, on the first day, the fortress line had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent defensive system in this sector, its elaborate fortifications reduced to obstacles Ukrainian forces had already bypassed or destroyed. The fortress line, which Russian commanders had assured Putin would hold indefinitely, had ceased to exist as a coherent defensive system in this sector. Ukrainian forces were operating in the open terrain beyond the fortifications, terrain that Russian defensive planning had assumed attackers could never reach, advancing toward objectives that commanders had marked as Phase 3 goals, not expected to be achieved for weeks. The haunting imagery emerging from the breakthrough shows defensive positions that were supposed to be impregnable, reduced to shattered bunkers and abandoned trenches. Dragon's teeth obstacles stand uselessly beside roads. Ukrainian vehicles travel freely. Minefields that were supposed to channel attackers into kill zones display the cleared lanes through which Ukrainian columns advanced. The elaborate fortifications that Russian engineering corps spent years constructing have become monuments to the failure of Russian defensive strategy, evidence visible from satellite imagery and drone footage that Ukrainian forces can breach whatever defenses Russia constructs. Here's the third hook. When your fortress becomes a museum of failure, when the obstacles you built stand as evidence of your defeat rather than guarantees of your defense, when satellite imagery shows cleared paths through minefields that were supposed to be impassable, you've lost something more significant than territory. You've lost the ability to believe that defensive construction can protect your positions, that fortification investment produces defensive results, that engineering can substitute for the combat capability your forces lack. The symbolism of breaching the fortress line carries weight that extends beyond immediate military implications to questions about the war's trajectory that this breakthrough may have decisively answered. Russia built these fortifications to guarantee control of occupied Ukrainian territory, to create facts on the ground that would eventually compel Ukraine to accept territorial losses, to demonstrate that Russian engineering could construct defenses Ukrainian forces could not overcome. The breach refutes every element of this strategy. Russian control is not guaranteed. The facts on the ground favor Ukrainian advance. Russian engineering has failed against Ukrainian capability. Consider what the breach symbolizes for Russian military prestige and the narrative Putin has constructed about Russian military power. Russian propaganda has presented these defensive lines as evidence of Russian military sophistication, as proof that Russia can construct fortifications that enemies cannot breach, as demonstration of the engineering capability that supposedly makes Russian positions secure. Ukrainian forces have demonstrated that this narrative was fantasy, that Russian fortifications can be breached, that Russian defensive engineering can be overcome, that Russian positions are not secure against enemies whose capability exceeds Russian expectations. What makes this symbolism even more devastating is the specific comparison Russian commanders invited by calling their fortifications the strongest since World War II. That comparison invites the obvious response. The Atlantic Wall, the strongest German fortifications of World War II, fell to Allied forces on D-Day. The Maginot Line, the strongest French fortifications, was bypassed and rendered irrelevant. History's lesson about fortifications is that they fail when attackers develop capabilities their designers didn't anticipate. Russian commanders apparently forgot this lesson, and Ukrainian forces have reminded them in terms that cannot be ignored. Think about that. Russian commanders compared their fortress line to the greatest fortifications of the 20th century, apparently forgetting that those fortifications all ultimately failed. Ukrainian forces have now added the Russian fortress line to that list of impressive defensive constructions that fell when tested. History's judgment on fortifications remains consistent. They delay, they do not prevent, and they fail entirely when attackers achieve capability that exceeds defensive assumptions. The human dimension of the breakthrough encompasses both the Russian defenders whose positions fell and the Ukrainian soldiers whose skill and courage achieved the breach. Russian soldiers who were told their positions were impregnable experienced the terror of discovering that assurance was false, of watching Ukrainian forces advance through obstacles that were supposed to be impassable, of facing the choice between death in bunkers or surrender to enemies whose capability exceeded anything they had been told to expect. Many chose surrender, recognizing the hopelessness of resistance against forces that had already proven they could not be stopped. Ukrainian soldiers who achieved the breach did so knowing the risks they faced, knowing the defenses they were attacking, knowing that failure would mean death in minefields and crossfire that Russian engineers had specifically designed to kill them. Their success reflects not just training and equipment, but courage that cannot be manufactured. the willingness to advance into prepared defenses against enemies who were waiting to kill them. The breakthrough is their achievement, their demonstration of what Ukrainian forces can accomplish when required. Here's the fourth hook. When soldiers advance into fortress defenses that military doctrine says should destroy them, when they breach obstacles that engineering should have made impassable, when they achieve in hours what planning said should take weeks, they've demonstrated something about human capability that transcends military analysis. Ukrainian soldiers didn't just break through Russian fortifications, they broke through assumptions about what was possible, demonstrated that courage and skill can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable, proved that free people fighting for their homeland can achieve what armies fighting for empire cannot prevent. For Russian military planners who have built their entire defensive strategy around fortified lines that were supposed to guarantee territorial control, the breach creates challenges that extend far beyond this single sector. If Ukrainian forces can breach the fortress line here, they can presumably breach similar fortifications elsewhere. The defensive investments Russia has made across the occupied territories, thousands of kilometers of trenches, millions of mines, countless bunkers, may all be as vulnerable as the positions that fell in this breakthrough. Russian planners must now contemplate defending territory without the confidence that prepared positions can hold against Ukrainian attack. The psychological impact extends throughout Russian military leadership, who must now explain to Putin how fortifications they assured him were impregnable fell in 36 hours. Commanders who staked their careers and credibility on defensive preparations that have now failed face consequences in a system where failure is punished severely. The blame shifting and recrimination that characterizes Russian command culture in the aftermath of defeat is reportedly already underway, with officers positioning themselves to avoid responsibility for a failure that cannot be concealed or explained away. The Kremlin's response to the breakthrough has reflected the genuine shock and disbelief that the breach clearly produced among leadership, who had been repeatedly and confidently assured that the fortress line would hold against any assault Ukraine could mount, regardless of Western support or Ukrainian determination. Emergency meetings convened within hours of reports that all three defensive belts had been breached, bringing together military commanders, intelligence officials, and the political leadership in sessions characterized by recrimination and blame shifting rather than constructive response. Putin reportedly demanded explanations for how defenses that had been personally briefed to him as impregnable defenses he had publicly praised as evidence of Russian military capability had fallen so quickly and so completely. Commanders who had assured him the fortress line guaranteed territorial control found themselves unable to provide answers that didn't amount to admission of comprehensive failure. The scramble to establish new defensive lines, to move reserves that should have been positioned forward weeks ago, to restore some coherence to a defensive scheme that has collapsed across an entire sector. All of this reflects a leadership caught completely off guard by events they had been assured were impossible. The implications for Russian military leadership are severe and personal. Officers responsible for defensive preparations face consequences in a system where failure is punished harshly and where someone must always be blamed for outcomes the leadership finds unacceptable. The fortress line's fall will produce scapegoats whose careers and potentially freedom will be sacrificed to deflect responsibility from higher levels where the true failures of judgment occurred. Western responses to the breakthrough have been carefully calibrated, but clearly celebratory, with officials across NATO recognizing the strategic significance of what Ukrainian forces have achieved. NATO members, whose training programs contributed to Ukrainian combined arms capability, see validation of years of investment. Intelligence agencies whose information supported Ukrainian planning see their contributions producing operational results. The breakthrough demonstrates that Western support for Ukraine produces strategic effects that justify continued investment. So tonight, as Ukrainian forces exploit their breakthrough and Russian commanders attempt to establish new defensive lines before Ukrainian advance makes even those positions untenable, remember this carefully. We're witnessing the decisive demonstration that Ukrainian offensive capability has surpassed Russian defensive capability, that the fortress strategy Russia employed to hold occupied territory has failed comprehensively, that the balance of military effectiveness has shifted in ways that Russian fortification cannot reverse. Power is being redefined from the ability to construct defenses to the ability to breach them. And Ukrainian forces have demonstrated they can breach whatever Russia builds. The fortress line that was supposed to guarantee Russian control of occupied territory has become proof that no Russian defensive position is secure. When historians examine this war, the breach of the fortress line will occupy decisive place as the moment when Ukrainian victory became militarily inevitable, when Russian defensive strategy was proven bankrupt, when the fortifications Russia built to hold stolen territory became evidence of failure rather than guarantees of control. You cannot hold territory behind fortresses that enemies can breach. You cannot guarantee security through defenses that fall in hours. And you cannot sustain the illusion of military capability when your most impressive defensive constructions become monuments to your defeat. The fortress line is breached. Ukrainian forces advance through terrain Russia thought they could never reach. And the Kremlin scrambles to address a defeat that no defensive preparation can reverse. Freedom breaks through walls that tyranny builds, proving that no fortification can permanently contain the determination of people fighting for their homeland. That's where we leave it tonight. A fortress fallen, defensive strategy shattered, and Ukrainian forces demonstrating that walls built to contain them will not stand. I'm Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.